Okay. Hello, good evening. Welcome to the live interaction session for week 11. This session was postponed from the previous day, from the session which is scheduled on Monday to today. So we will basically be covering the topics which have already been elaborated in week 11, along with the assignment questions as well that you have already submitted. And we'll have a final session on Monday for this course on basics of biology, and we'll wrap up with a summary of all of the topics. So, as you already are aware, the theme or the central topic for this week was around the idea of homeostasis, and that has been discussed over the three lectures that were taken up during this week. So, if you remember, we'll look at the this week as well as the upcoming week's live interaction session would be more of um, a holistic approach towards overall biology, over the way we have understood each of these different topics and how they are all correlated with each other. So, if you remember, at the very beginning, we had started off with understanding of a living organism via the basic life processes, which includes evolution, how over the course of times organisms have evolved in different ways, which has allowed them to adapt to the changing environment, to the changing conditions, and has helped them become the best version that is capable of surviving in the current circumstances, in the current situation. So we understood evolution, we understood how classification of these organisms is done, and how important it is for this classification to persist in order to better our understanding of living beings as a whole, and understand how each of the different adaptations that have occurred, how they're allowing them to survive the best, just like I already said. So, after classification and evolution, we understood cells, we understood each of the different aspects of cells, the organelles, their functions. Then we looked at the different biomolecules, um, biological macromolecules, you can put it that way, and how they are individually responsible for executing all of the processes that we understand are survival essential, which like we've already discussed, are the basic processes that you don't even necessarily have to think about, but they are anyway, um, they're being carried out within your body under all circumstances, and they are necessary for your body to survive. And after that, we also understood a bit about different cellular processes and about physiology. So, if you think about the requirements of life, all of this was at great detail, right? Cellular processes, the biological macromolecules, what are the different functions that each of these has to play, and a lot more detail. But if you think about it, you require nutrients. When we say nutrients, what do we mean? We mean everything that we are consuming, every food item that you consume, that is broken down, right? And each of these molecules, or each of these food items, whether it is a carbohydrate, a protein, a fat, etc., each of these biomolecules are further broken down to produce monomers, to produce little, you can think of them as little bits and pieces, which are ultimately used in the generation of energy, which allows you to execute each of the different life processes that are survival essential, which allows you to synthesize new molecules for the upcoming future, and effectively helps you to survive. So, nutrients are absolutely a basic need, and a large part of the nutritional requirement, it comes from the food that you take in. Hence, it is a requirement of life. Then comes oxygen. So, while you understand that respiration is a process that is involuntary, that you don't necessarily have to think about, and your body has taken up the responsibility of constantly allowing you to breathe. It is controlled by your nervous system. It is controlled by a regulated pumping of blood through your body, and the exchange of gases which are occurring in the lungs. All of that has been made independent of an individual's ability to regulate. But what can be controlled is the environment that you are in. If an individual is at a very high altitude where there is a very um, where the lack of oxygen is very intense, or if they are somewhere very deep under, like in some underground in a mine, or some other situation where the concentration of oxygen in the surrounding environment is extremely low. In other words, if it is an anoxic condition, then it becomes very difficult for such a person to be able to execute these processes and therefore, by and large, survive. So, oxygen is yet another extremely important requisite for an individual to be able to survive. Next comes water. So you'll find a very large number of statistics about um, how the human body is 90%, 95%, 97%. These statistics are variable, but what it effectively means is that a major chunk of the human body is basically water. Like in order to, that's why, most of the time we are asked to stay hydrated, we are asked to drink a lot of water, and it has a large implication in the overall health of an individual. Yes, overconsumption of water is also not healthy. It sort of pushes your excretory system, particularly your kidneys. It's a huge stress on the kidneys as well. So what you need to ensure is that a balanced diet also should include a balanced consumption of water so that your needs are met and enough is available for other purposes as well. But it should not be over the top either. Then comes the normal body temperature. Now, while that is a requisite of life, or it's a requirement of life, it's not something that you or me or any person necessarily has to maintain under normal circumstances. So your body basically has like a thermostat, which is effectively your hypothalamus, which is able to um, sense the temperature of the surroundings, and it tries to modulate the body's core temperature. When I say core temperature, it means your the temperature in your um, extremely sensitive internal organs, which is your liver, your kidney, your stomach, your brain, etc. So if there is, suppose you move to a place where there is compared to your normal habitat, the temperature differences of say 40 degrees Celsius, from a very warm place to suddenly a very cool place. So your body will try its best to ensure that this change of temperature, while on the outside is huge, on the inside, its internal organs do not get damaged and do not perceive it as some form of immense stress, and they're able to withstand that huge change in the environmental conditions and are able to perform their functions regularly. So that maintenance of normal body temperature, normal body conditions overall, is what we understand by homeostasis. So homeostasis basically means a balance that is, or you can think of it as a, um, if I give an example, if you think about two extremes, right? If you think about, say suppose there's a scale, and that scale is from 1 to 9 for any particular condition. Say the stress that you feel on a normal day, a very nice day when you're on a picnic or something like that, is a 1. You barely feel any stress at all, versus on a day when you have some huge work commitments, or you have some examination or some sort of very stressful situation which is taking over a lot of your mental capacity, your peace, your calm, and your well, for lack of a better word, sanity. Then on such days, you feel a stress which can be ranked somewhere around 9, right? So what you want, what the body tries to do is to try and steer away from any of these extremes, and it will try to maintain a somewhat mean value, which would be somewhere close to say 5. So the average, right? So this tendency of the human body to stay at a normal condition and maintain that normal condition and have the ability to come back to this normalcy from any deviation that might occur is basically homeostasis. And the fifth point, we have atmospheric pressure, appropriate atmospheric pressure, that would also be considered under an requirement or requisite of life. So, like we were discussing, homeostasis basically means, well, this is a bit of a tall claim. What it effectively means is unchanging. That is, irrespective of what is happening around you, your body tries to stay zen, tries to stay normal and stable. So it tries to maintain this relatively stable internal environment regardless of what is happening around. And it's not that it's very rigid, it will never fluctuate. That's not possible. It will allow changes, but they are within narrow limits. Like I said, if I take that example, keep in mind that this example was hypothetical. There is no such scale in reality which can really do so. But if you think about 1 and 9 as the extremes, the body will try to maintain somewhere around plus minus, will try to maintain 5 plus minus 1. So it can, some days the body will try to maintain a stress which is around 4, and some days it will try to maintain around 6. But overall, it will maintain a balanced condition. So narrow limits are allowed or are excused. And yeah, and the result that comes out of the, or you can say that homeostasis is the result of a dynamic equilibrium. What do these two words mean? Equilibrium means, and if you consider an equation, the two sides are equal. So that equal nature, or that equal condition is brought about by the or as a result of an equilibrium that is maintained. When we say dynamic, it means that it's not rigid. Equilibrium is not constant, it keeps on changing. But because of two changes that are complementing each other at all times, the equilibrium always remains maintained. So that is what we mean by dynamic equilibrium. Now we'll come to some processes or some uh, mechanisms that are particularly regulating this condition, that are regulating homeostasis. So the first subtype, or the first example, is of auto-regulation or intrinsic regulation. So as you understand by this, by the very name, right, the nomenclature itself is quite self-sufficient. When we say auto-regulation, it means self-regulation. You are able to control, modulate, maintain, and regulate internally, which is why it is also called as intrinsic regulation. So when there is some sort of an environmental change, a default reaction or a default response is brought about by that cell or tissue or organ, and that normal homeostatic condition is then maintained. The second type is extrinsic regulation. When we say extrinsic, it is external. So your nervous system and your endocrine system, they are regulating or they are controlling these responses, and therefore the master control, or the master, you can say, think of it as a master key. It lies not within the or it's not default program that is already present in the cell, but instead it is because of some sort of an extrinsic regulation or extrinsic control. Majorly this is carried out or executed by the nervous and the endocrine systems. Now, here we look at the parts of a homeostasis machinery. So here homeostasis has been visualized as a machine, and it has different components, all of which are together, um, if together effectively functioning in order to maintain homeostasis. So first we start with the stimulus. Stimulus is the initiating point or the start point. So from the normal condition, when there is a deviation, what is happening? It is the stimulus. It is generating a sort of pulse or a signal which is indicating that something has shifted or something has changed. And the measurement of this change or this error is carried out by the sensor. Next, the sensor is, you can think of it as a second component, which is able to capture this change in the stimulus, and is able to recognize that, oh, some change has occurred. Then comes the integrator, which is comparing multiple signals. Usually brain has a role to play here. The effector, usually an organ and tissue, it um, it executes an effect in response to the stimulus that came in. And the response is the change that you will see now compared to the previous condition. And finally, what is understood is the result, that because of this particular type of change, what is the final result that has occurred. So that is what we understand by the hypothetical sorry, hypothetical homeostasis machinery. So we will next look into the two types of homeostatic regulation, or two types of cyclic patterns that are that exist, and those are the positive and the negative. Think about them as positive feedback loops and negative feedback loops, and we'll just come back to it after a very brief break. So coming back to the discussion, we were talking about the two types of homeostatic regulations, which are positive and negative in nature. So the negative feedback system, which is actually the more common sort of, or the common mechanism of control that is operational in the homeostatic regulation system. What it basically means is, what do you understand by feedback? Feedback means that if you think about any survey or any purchase that you make nowadays, online purchases are very common, right? So in response to the purchase, the customer is asked by the seller or company to provide a feedback, which is a which is a sort of in simple terms of it, you can think of it as a response, right? So when we okay, so when we talk about homeostasis, what it basically means is that there is an initiation point, which is, of course, the stimulus, and there's an endpoint, which is, of course, the result. Now, the result that is generated as a response to the stimulus is in itself the reason why no further stimulus would be generated. So suppose you think of it as, okay, say when you have, if you think about fear as an object or as a response, right? It's a response. When you see something which is scary, for example, if you suddenly, uh, you see some scary animal, like for example, one of the lectures, the example was of a lion. When you see a lion, your body will immediately or okay, let's think of it differently. Let's think of a dog, right? A dog, when a lot of children, when they are very young, are very scared of dogs. So when you would see that dog, your initial response is of fear, and your body will keep on producing a little more fear until it sort of gets saturated and no further fear would be generated. Instead, if any more fear is generated, it will stop the initial stimulus. So you think of it as point A and point B. Point A is resulting in an increase in point B, but way too much increase of point B is inhibiting any further increase in point A. So that is a negative feedback loop, that when the response or the result increases to a level that it is now inhibiting the stimulus itself, then that is a negative feedback system. So what it does is it's actually quite common. In fact, it's more common than the positive one. It reverses any further change. So what it would do is it would result in a lot of fluctuations about the set point or the normal conditions. And example here given is that of body temperature. So yeah, so that is the first example. The second is a positive feedback system, which is actually a lot less common or a lot more rare. So positive feedback is a condition where the stimulus, when it results in a response, the response acts in a positive manner and it stimulates more of the stimulus, and it keeps on increasing, like it would keep on increasing in a very steep manner, and the change keeps on getting exponentially increasing, and or it keeps on increasing exponentially, or you can think of it as an amplification, right? So an example of this is, as here it is shown, is an infection in the body. So your immune system, if you remember, we had discussed this during our discussions on the immune system as well, that the immune system has a memory which is in place. It remembers when it encounters an antigen it has seen before. Now, when it encounters such an antigen, in response, it initiates a response which gets increased many folds, and more of the same immune cells that have been able to recognize the pathogen, only those are produced. That is the process of clonal selection and clonal expansion. So, for example, if bacteria A was something you were infected in when you were a child of, say, 5 years of age, and again when you were 20 years, you get infected by the same bacterial species or same strain, then your body will remember, recognize, and in response use its memory to initiate another response. And yeah, so we were discussing about the positive feedback system. So an example of it is the immune system, like we have already discussed previously. So if your body encounters a bacterial pathogen, say for example, somebody who was infected with TB during their childhood, if that same, okay, not TB, let's think about chickenpox, right? Chickenpox is caused by it's a viral infection. So when an individual or when a child suffers from chickenpox during their early childhood, then what happens? The body has already recognized some epitopes or some portion, some antigen from the virus, from the varicella zoster virus, and in response to that, when the same individual encounters the same antigen at some later stage in their life, the body will immediately elicit a response which will increase many folds, and that amplified response would be generated very, very quickly. So yeah, so they would leave quite it gets amplified quite quickly, and this amplified response is a requisite as well. So, I'm not sure. So yeah, these are the two types of feedback systems as we have discussed already. Now, the regulation of homeostasis and details has been provided here. I just gave you an overview. We'll just go through this much faster. So there is a set point, which is the ideal um, default value. You can think of it as the default value, the normal value of a particular variable. So what is your body temperature set point? So under normal circumstances, the physiological temperature is considered to be around 37 to 37.2 degrees Celsius. However, when you think about errors, errors are normal values that are not exactly the set point. So from this set point, some amount of deviation is allowed, and that would be considered as an error. So yeah, so for example, your body would allow some deviation from it, say around plus minus 2 degrees, would or 1.5 degrees would be allowed. But when it fluctuates even more than that, then that means there is a problem. There is something that your body is trying to fight against, which is an infection in this case. And under those circumstances, you get a fever because your body is trying to clear out that infection. It is it is increasing the temperature to reduce the chances of survival of that pathogen in your body, and is trying to eliminate the same. So that is what we see here. So it occurs when the change in one direction is producing a change in the other. It is the opposite feedback mechanism of positive feedback, which is responsible for reversing the stimulus by activating the opposite responses. And it leads to reduced productivity of that initial stimulus. Now, it is the most important for maintaining a for maintaining the constant internal environment. So to maintain the set point that we have been talking about quite extensively, you need negative feedback system very to be operational and to be functioning properly. So examples here are the regulation of body temperature, blood pH, hormone levels, O2 CO2 balance, blood sugar, blood pressure, acid base, osmoregulation, calcium homeostasis, and the energy balance. So here if you see, when your body temperature exceeds 37, then nerve cells in the skin and brain, they're able to sense it, they get sensitized, and the temporary regulatory center in the brain, majorly the hypothalamus, what it will do is it will activate the sweat glands in your body, and it will release, or it will result in the um, release of this, or it will reduce the overall body temperature by making that person sweat through their eccrine glands, and as a result it will cool down the body and bring the temperature down. So yeah, that is the regulation of body temperature. Uh, Here we go through some more examples, like for example, regulation of blood glucose. We actually will get into this later as well, where the pancreas it has this immensely important role to play in maintaining the blood glucose of the body. So the reason, look, if you think about it, why isn't it by default always maintained? The reason behind this is that every food item you consume will affect the blood sugar in your body, or almost all food items that you consume, because any carbohydrate would be broken down. Any sweet item that you consume, any sugar in any format, any fruit you consume, all of them have sugars, and all of that has to be broken down. And when that happens, the blood glucose levels in your body would be affected. Now, this level cannot keep on increasing indefinitely, because that would damage a lot of organs in your body, and it would be extremely detrimental to an individual's survival as well. So the pancreas has this immense responsibility of releasing some regulatory enzymes, or not enzymes, regulatory hormones, which always keep a check on this, and they maintain a basal requisite and balanced level of blood glucose in circulation within most individuals. So if you think about it, the normal range that is usually supplied in reports that you get for uh, probably some member in your family, those are quite variable. These levels or this range is not really fixed. It is just set based on the blood glucose of a lot of normal individuals. An approximation is made, and it is ranging somewhere around 70 to 110 milligrams per deciliter of blood. Another reason why this regulation is extremely crucial is because because sugar is able to cross the blood-brain barrier, and very huge fluctuations in blood glucose levels can severely affect brain function. And finally, we see the mention of the pancreas, the major communicator in this entire process, and particularly the islets of Langerhans have a role to play here. So when your blood glucose, say it reaches somewhere close to 120, 130, or some higher levels of blood, then what happens? Then beta cells of the islets of Langerhans would start performing their function, and they would release insulin in the blood. This insulin would go to the body cells, to adipose, liver, skeletal muscles, etc. What they would do is they would increase the uptake of liver and skeletal muscles, or if they would increase the uptake of glucose in the liver, skeletal muscles, and all of these extreme organs, which are quite, for lack of a better word, they're not they're not deficient in glucose, but they're capable of utilizing glucose quite quickly, quite efficiently. And what they would do is they would be able to break down glucose into glycogen, and blood glucose would be around 110 milligrams per deciliter, which is bringing it back to the normal range. Now, what you need to understand, this cannot keep on happening indefinitely, right? If you keep on utilizing all of the glucose that is in the blood, then that individual would suffer from a whole other range of problems, which are low blood glucose problems, where a person starts feeling faint, and they would feel really sick, really weak. So there has to be an inhibitory mechanism as well, which operates and which controls excessive decrease in the blood glucose levels as well. So we'll come to that later. The second is regulation of temperature. So when you have an increase in the body temperature, then these thermoreceptors, which are temperature sensitive receptors or proteins that are found in the skin, in the hypothalamus, they are able to sense that the temperature has increased. They're able to communicate it to the hypothalamus, which is the integrator. In response to this, when this change is too rapid or too much, in response to this, the skin blood vessels and the sweat glands, they are communicated, and they lead to a vasodilation in the blood vessels of skin, which releases more and more heat from the surface. And as a result, because of the release of heat, because of formation of sweat, there is an overall reduction in the internal or the core body temperature, and that person starts feeling a lot better. So positive feedback, positive feedback homeostasis, it occurs in response to an output variation, whereby the output would vary even more in the direction of initial deviation. So it encourages or it promotes the change to keep on increasing, and the change will amplify until and unless there is removal of the initial stimulus. So the most commonly studied example of this is during childbirth, the release of oxytocin. It occurs continuously in a positive feedback loop to generate more and more contractions within the expectant mother's cervix and uterus, which will further, like, it would encourage, or it would support the birth or the delivery of the child or the infant. So the pushing of the child's head movements, or the head downwards, it induces the release of oxytocin, which stimulates further cervical contractions, and it sort of creates a pressure on it. These contractions continue to stimulate the release of oxytocin until a baby is finally born. Then comes lactation. Stimulating milk production by breastfeeding causes further feeding and continues until the baby stops. Then comes lactation. This is also again a part of the gestational, post-gestational habits as well. So the stimulation, more and more milk would be produced in the in a mother who has just given birth, because of the feeding from the baby. So the more a baby feeds, the more and more milk is generated in an individual's in the mother's mammary glands, and more milk is available for the baby to actually feed on effectively. Ovulation is the process which is also showing a positive feedback of mechanism operating during it. So the release of estrogen by dominant follicle inside the ovary, that actually stimulates the release of FSH LH, further stimulates the growth of the follicle. So it keeps on increasing in size, and it is a part of the normal female cycle as well. Blood clotting and fruit ripening are also examples of these positive feedback loops only. So if you see here, a tabular chart has been provided. So positive feedback shows amplification or growth of the output signal. Negative feedback results in inhibition or um, slowing down of a process. Then the effect upon the stimulus is that its positive feedback strengthens the stimulus and it increases the productivity, while negative feedback reduces the signal effect with reduced or decreased productivity. Frequency of occurrence is also different. It's more frequent. Positive feedback is less frequent, whereas the negative feedback is a lot more frequent. Effect on the stability of the system. Positive feedback doesn't have much to do with stability of the system, whereas negative feedback does. And examples would be here, it is childbirth and blood clotting. While here we see the optimal internal environment, which gets controlled by temperature, pH, hormone levels, and other processes. So the similarity between these two, they are both important. You can never um, have a living organism where only these positive feedback mechanisms are operational and vice versa. And they are both responsible for actually maintaining a stable environment in any biological system for that reason. And it actually controls the amount of equity or the amount of give me a second. Yeah, so they maintain the stable environment either by strengthening or lowering the effects of a specific stimulus. So here we see sort of a representative schematic that shows the same, where if you think about this as a plank and these two as weights, then as a seesaw, in fact, then if there is a disturbance from one end, there is a readjustment that is done in order to restore the balance that was initially disrupted. So here you see these terms which are all correlated with each other, like homeostasis, regulation, endocrine, excretory system, coordination, water balance, all of this together maintains the state of homeostasis. So with this, we are at the end of the first lecture discussion. Um, in the in the second lecture, within the same overall concept only, we delve into a huge, you can think about it as a different. Problem is occurring here. I don't know what it is. Yeah, sorry. So we were talking about the endocrine system. So what do you understand by the endocrine system? It is the organ system within, not organ system, it is a part of a living being's physiological setups, which is actually responsible for the major system that is responsible for homeostasis. So the endocrine system basically is the hormonal regulation that persists within any individual's body. And that is majorly dominated by negative feedback under normal circumstances, because we are talking about homeostasis, which would be functional in order to operate, in order to maintain the normal status only. Of course, if you consider situations where an individual is suffering from some sort of a disease, that could be, it could be cancer, it could be some neurodegenerative disease, or many other things. Your homeostasis, it's actually the disturbance of homeostasis which is leading to these a number of different problems. So here we are talking about the normal system, which operates upon negative feedback. And when we say endocrine, it basically means these glands, they are ductless glands, and they are producing hormones which diffuse into blood, and they initially show some slow effects, but there are some effects which can end up under certain circumstances, can end up persisting for a much longer period of time. And hormones, they act on specific targets. So if you talk about the endocrine organs, there is a huge set of organs there as well. First, we look at the like here the order has been, I think, depending upon the location within the body, they have been ranked. So oh, sorry, I didn't realize I got muted. But okay, so I was talking about the endocrine glands within the body. So it starts off with the pineal gland, the hypothalamus. I have mentioned the hypothalamus previously also quite a few times. Uh, it's a very, very significant part of the brain. And it is also, like I previously said, the thermostat for our body as well. Then comes the pituitary. It is it is the master gland, which has really intensely different and intensely important roles to play as well. So there is the posterior and the anterior pituitary, each of which has different roles. It releases different types of hormones, regulates different kind of activities, and executes obviously different types of reactions to the same. So we'll go over those one by one. And then comes the thyroid gland. Um, okay, we'll get to those in detail. Let's just go over the names. The thyroid gland, then the parathyroid, also very close to the thyroid glands as well. The thymus, the adrenal glands, the adrenal cortex and adrenal medulla, even though they are uh, technically they are the same glands, they are located in different parts of the adrenal, and they are responsible for releasing different types of hormones. And yeah, then comes the pancreas, the gonads, kidneys, adipocytes, and the small intestine. So we'll first go over the mechanisms of hormone action. So different types, let me just zoom in a little bit. Different types of hormones, they have different mechanisms which operate in each case. So first are the steroid hormones. Steroids, okay, so depending upon the nature of the hormone, like there are steroid hormones, there are peptide hormones, etc. Depending on their physiological properties, the mechanisms which operate for each of these are actually quite different. Now, since you understand, steroid hormones, they are obviously synthesized from cholesterol. As a result of this, they are capable of passing through the semi-permeable, like like the lipid bilayer or the cell membrane or the plasma membrane. They are capable of diffusing through it, entering the cell, and then gaining access to their receptor. That is why steroid hormone receptors are not localized on the cell surface. They can be localized inside, and they are able to move through these membranes. They are able to diffuse through lipid bilayers. So here the hormone can enter the cell and it can bind to its receptor. In fact, it can even go and bind to its receptor inside the nucleus, because the nuclear membrane is also of a similar nature, right? It's also a lipid layer. So it can pass through that as well. So it can do so after binding to the receptor, obviously. So first, the hormone would diffuse through the cell membrane. Then the hormone and receptor complex together would migrate or would translocate. That's the actual term. They would translocate through the nuclear membrane as well. Why would it do so? This is because they would be able to act as transcription factors, and they would bind to DNA. They would bind to some regions within the DNA, and they would execute the or they would regulate the synthesis of some specific mRNA. Like for example, here it is given how testosterone works. Testosterone is a steroid hormone which is responsible for increasing sperm production. So sperm production cannot increase just out of nowhere, right? It executes its action on some other players, which effectively leads to this downstream effect. So that's what we see here. So protein, all first protein synthesis is occurring. This protein is altering the function of the cell, and testosterone, how it increases sperm production, is an example of this exact same process. Then coming to non-steroid hormones. So steroid hormones, the very nature, their physiological properties allow them to diffuse, and as a result, they are able to bind to the receptors inside the cell. On the other hand, non-steroid hormones, like for example, say pituitary hormones, these are peptide hormones. Then insulin, glucagon, these are all peptides. So they cannot execute similar properties, and as a result, their hormones do not enter inside the cell. So their hormone is the first messenger which has to bind onto the receptor on the cell membrane. It can never come, or not never, it does not normally come inside the cell, and instead the binding of this hormone to its receptor itself acts as the signal or the stimulus for eliciting the downstream responses. So here we see the example of a non-steroid hormone, which is acting as the first messenger. If you see the cursor, yeah. So it's the first messenger. It is binding here onto the receptor, which has to be localized on the cell surface because obviously the hormone is not able to move in. And in response to this, um, there are some downstream effectors which are coming in. Like for example, it could lead to the formation or production of a secondary messenger like cyclic AMP that alters cellular activities. And example of this are pituitary hormones, which are non-steroidal in nature, which means they're not derived from steroids, not derived from cholesterol. Regulation of the endocrine system. So here we have the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland. On the left, if you look here, yeah, the adenohypophysis and the neurohypophysis. There is from the pituitary, hormone 1 would be, this is a schematic representation, hormone 1 would be released, which would act upon the endocrine gland that would release hormone 2, which would act on the target cells. This is why the pituitary is called as the master regulator. It does not necessarily release the hormone that will affect a target cell, but it releases some mediator or some component which actually acts upon us. It releases a component or releases a signal which acts upon the mediator that controls the target cell or that affects the target cells. So here you see multiple examples of this as well. Like for example, thyroid stimulating hormone, which is hormone 1 from the pituitary. Um, First, you get the releasing hormone, which is thyrotropin releasing hormone. Then comes the thyroid stimulating hormone, which acts upon the thyroid gland because the stimulating hormone is acting upon the gland itself, upon the endocrine gland itself. Now the endocrine gland would release its own hormones, which are from the target organ, that are the thyroid hormones. So you have multiple examples of this. Then corticotropin releasing hormone um, acts on the pituitary, and then from the pituitary we have the ACTH, which is the adrenocorticotrophic hormone, and from there you have the suprarenal cortex, which is effectively releasing the glucocorticoids. So While the target organ is are the adrenal glands, the executor or the master regulator is still the pituitary, the hypothalamus. So they are lying right at the top, but because of this nature of ductless glands, they are able to execute their actions on any and every part of the body. Okay, so that is mentioned there. Then we come to GnRH, which is gonadotrophin releasing hormone. Okay. Yeah, under that we have FSH and LH. So FSH and is from it acts upon follicle stimulating hormone. It acts upon the testes and the ovaries. So follicle stimulating hormone is acting upon its target organs or target glands, which are releasing inhibin and estrogens respectively. On the other hand, luteinizing hormone or LH, which is acting upon the ovaries and testes as well, is releasing another different set of hormones, which are known as the progestins and estrogens from ovaries, whereas androgens are released from the testes. So you can see that the same endocrine organ would release different types of um, different types of hormone twos depending upon where the stimulus is coming from hormone 1. So if it is FSH, then the testes would behave or would release differently, different hormones. On the other hand, if it is LH, then we get a different response. So that is exactly what is indicating the fine-tuned regulation that is operational inside the endocrine system of our bodies. So the hypothalamus basically is sitting right at the top and it is controlling everything that will go on within the entire body. So first we see here so the hypothalamus communicates with the anterior pituitary via the hypothalamic, the HHPV, which is the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal vein. What it does is it dumps these large lot of protein hormones into the portal vein from where it goes to the anterior pituitary, which is the adenohypophysis. So this is if you really want to remember this, it's the best idea in my opinion is to make like a flow chart in order to avoid any confusion, because this is a lot of memory work that you just simply have to remember. So releasing hormones. So if you went through it a little carefully, you would have seen that there are two types of hormones from the hypothalamus, some which are releasing in nature and some others which would be sort of inhibitory in nature. So releasing hormones, they stimulate hormone production in the anterior pituitary, whereas inhibition or inhibitory hormones, they would be responsible for preventing this production in the anterior pituitary. So the adenohypophysis is under the rule of the hypothalamus or is under the control of the hypothalamus because of the or via the portal vein. It releases 6 different hormones into the blood: TSH, ACTH, FSH, LH, prolactin, and the growth hormone. So all of these are being released by the anterior pituitary, and these are really, really sensitive hormones which fluctuate a lot, but their control is maintained very diligently within the body, and it must be maintained very diligently as well. So here you see the direct control by nervous system. Indirect control of regulatory hormones, direct release of hormones. As you can see here, it executes this effect on all of these different organs. And you can see how the effect is occurring. Either it is direct or it is indirect. Yeah, so this is the anterior pituitary or the adenohypophysis of the pituitary gland, which works in a different manner. So it releases ACTH. From here you see glucocorticoids, epinephrine, norepinephrine, then TSH upon thyroid hormones T3, T4. Upon the mammary glands, it releases prolactin, somatomedins from GH, then the inhibin testosterone from here, from FSH, LH, and MSH, which act then ADH, etc. You can see the entire cycle which is present. So the anterior pituitary, like we have discussed, is under the direct control of the hypothalamus, and it occurs via the portal vein. Now, the next question that obviously comes up is, what about the posterior pituitary? It is the neurohypophysis which communicates with the hypothalamus via nerve axons from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary. It releases two different hormones into the blood. One, the antidiuretic hormone, and two, oxytocin. Next, we come to the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland regulates the basal metabolic rate, or the BMR, of an individual, and the hormone responsible for doing so is thyroxine. So if you see here, it regulates blood calcium as well, and it does so in corroboration with the parathyroid gland that releases calcitonin when high in blood. So basal metabolic rate is maintained by the T3 and T4 hormones, which increase metabolic rate and they affect the body temperature as well. So T3 and T4 are particularly released by the follicular cells of the thyroid gland. T3 is triiodothyronine and T4 is thyroxine. So these in like their abbreviated forms are T3 and T4 respectively. So that was the function of the thyroid gland. So a representative schematic is also shown here. So if you see the hypothalamus, what it would first secrete is the thyrotropin releasing hormone, or TRH. Then it acts upon the adenohypophysis, which would act upon the which would release TSH from the thyroid gland. So thyroid follicle would release T3 and T4, and that would restore homeostasis when homeostasis is initially disturbed under certain conditions where there is a low body temperature, or there is, for whatever reasons, less and less T3 and T4. However, there are disorders also when okay, so like we have initially said, the hormone system, or in particular the endocrine system, is responsible for causing homeostasis, but or maintaining homeostasis. But when homeostasis is not maintained, what it effectively leads to is a large number of diseases. Now, these diseases can be quite variable in nature, but what we majorly see are some sort of hormonal issues which can be tackled by hormonal supplements. So, for example, if we talk about thyroid disorders, there is hypo and hyperthyroidism. Under conditions of hypothyroidism, there is a low amount of, or low levels of thyroid in the individual's blood, thyroid hormones in the individual's blood. What it leads to is weight gain. It leads to lethargy and potential depression. Hyperthyroidism, which is an overactive thyroid gland, what it leads to is Graves' disease. So when an individual suffers from Graves' disease, major most visible symptoms in particular are very enlarged eyeballs, bulging in nature. They have goiter and a very enlarged thyroid gland, and it leads to hyperactivity, leads to insomnia, etc. And usually, as a solution, a portion of the thyroid gland is removed. Next, we come to the adrenal gland. Okay, so the adrenal gland has a large number of roles to play. It is one of the most, you can say, most active contributors to the entire endocrine system. Why? You would understand it. It has a largely variable role to play. So first we look at the different types of hormones which are released by the adrenal cortex. Now, whenever we say cortex, it basically means the outermost part, right? So the cortex is the outer part, while the medulla is the inner part. Oh, just a second. Yeah. So the adrenal cortex, first set of hormones that are released from it are the glucocorticoids, second are the mineralocorticoids, and third are the androgens. Glucocorticoids released, mainly example is cortisol. It is released under stress conditions. It causes tissues to increase more and more blood glucose. It stores more and more glucose. Sorry, yeah, it stores more glucose, which is in the form of glycogen, and it decreases the immune response. The second set are the mineralocorticoids. So these are both corticoids because they're released from the adrenal cortex, but because of their nature or their physiological composition, they are named differently. They are either glucocorticoids or they're mineralocorticoids. So mineralocorticoids are released from the zona glomerulosa. So the first one, the site of release is also different. In case of the glucocorticoids, the release occurs from the zona fasciculata, whereas mineralocorticoids are released from zona glomerulosa. It increases the blood volume by increasing sodium water reabsorption and potassium secretion from the kidneys. And third set of hormones are from zona reticularis. These are multiple zones within the adrenal cortex itself, and the hormones released under it are the sex hormones. So what is the stress response that is occurring? It is controlled by the adrenal cortex only, and in particular under Cushing syndrome. When an individual suffers from Cushing syndrome or Cushing syndrome, they are said to have hypercortisolism, which means they have very high or very elevated levels of cortisol in their bodies. And this is attributed to the adrenal or pituitary glands, or a hyperactive adrenal or pituitary glands, or under certain circumstances, if an individual suffers from an addiction to glucocorticoid drugs, then they can have such elevated levels of cortisol in their body. And these are responsible for storage of a lot of fat in the face of, in such patients you see a lot of fat storage in their face. There's a increase fat storage in their face as well as midsection, and they respond to only very high levels of insulin, and usually such patients also suffer from type 2 diabetes. So it's a very serious disease. It leads to it significantly affects the lifestyle of such individuals, and therefore it needs to be understood, diagnosed, and treated in due course of time. uh, Aldosterone, it is responsible for regulating the blood volume. It is released by the or is secreted by the adrenal cortex, and the trigger hormone is angiotensin 2. It promotes more and more sodium reabsorption by the kidney tubules. I think we'll come to this also during the excretory system as part of lecture 3. And sodium can move back into blood and water would follow by osmosis. I'm not getting into it now. Uh, then comes the adrenal medulla. So that those were the hormones released by the adrenal cortex. When we talk about the medulla, it is more interior or more located towards the inner side. So here the CNS, it synapses directly with the adrenal medulla. Yeah, it synapses directly with the adrenal medulla, which is the neural response. The adrenal medulla releases epinephrine and norepinephrine. Yeah. So these are actually the key enzymes that operate in response, or that operate in order to execute or control and execute your fight and flight response. That when an individual is encountered with a stressful situation, whether they would tackle it by fighting against it, or they would choose the survival and run away from it, is basically the fight and flight response. So the epinephrine and norepinephrine hormones are responsible for controlling the same. It stimulates more and more usage of glucose and glycogen, and it leads to more and more lipid release from adipocytes or fat cells. What it does is, when it is faced with such a situation, it would increase the heart rate, the blood pressure, and would lead to more and more vasoconstriction of the blood vessels. And the stress and low blood glucose can also lead to an increase in epinephrine as well as norepinephrine. Then comes the posterior pituitary and antidiuretic hormone. The posterior pituitary, it releases ADH or the antidiuretic hormone, vasopressin, into the blood when osmolarity in the blood is quite high. So ADH, basically it targets the kidney, and what it effectively is doing is it is reabsorbing. So that's what I said about a balanced intake or balanced consumption of water is also extremely crucial towards maintenance of homeostasis. So if an individual is under a situation where they are, they need to they need to reabsorb blood, reabsorb water back into the body and concentrate their urine, then this hormone, it comes into play. So it reabsorbs water and it decreases blood osmolarity, maintaining it somewhere close to 300 milliosmoles, and ensures that less urine is formed. So this is under conditions where you are a little bit dehydrated and your body needs more water to regulate its basic functions, and therefore less and less urine is formed, and it is more concentrated in nature as well. So that is under dehydration conditions, to answer the question that is written above. Then comes the pancreas. So like we have already discussed, it has digestive functions, it has endocrine functions. It is the endocrine function or the endocrine cells of the pancreas are particularly the islets of Langerhans. The alpha cells within the pancreas are the glucagon, are responsible for release of glucagon. Beta cells are responsible for releasing insulin, and they together are maintaining homeostasis when it comes to the blood glucose levels, which is something we have also discussed as well. So insulin is stimulating when the blood glucose level, um, when the glucose level in the blood is quite high, then insulin increases and it stimulates more and more uptake of blood glucose inside the cell. Second comes in glucagon. When glucagon is released, what it would do is it would trigger, it would sense that less and less blood glucose is present, and as a result, it would break down the stored sugars in the body, and it would trigger glycogen, which is the stored form of sugar in the body, and it would trigger its breakdown. Third comes somatostatin, which inhibits insulin, which inhibits insulin and glucagon secretion both. So it has a dual role. It inhibits the secretion of both, and it is responsible, like the name statin itself indicates, statins are usually responsible for inhibiting production. So somatostatin has that role to play here. When blood glucose is low, for example, when you wake up, then glucagon is released into the blood, and glycogen storage is broken down to produce more and more energy in order to allow you to function for the rest of your day. It increases blood glucose by causing the liver to break down glycogen. On the other hand, high blood glucose, when blood glucose is quite high after a meal, then insulin is released into the blood. Then insulin is released into the blood and it decreases blood glucose by causing glucose to go inside the body cells, and liver cells would be able to store glucose in the form of glycogen. So this is something we have already discussed. And when there is a disturbance in this entire chain from, the stimulator, the sensor, the response and the result, what it effectively leads to is a disease condition, which a large part of the Indian population actually suffers from, and that is diabetes. So blood glucose homeostasis gets disrupted by both types of diabetes mellitus, type 1 and type 2. And here you see an example of the same. And finally, as part of the third lecture, and this will go over a little bit quickly so that we can tackle the assignment questions and can, basically conclude the class for today. So, yeah. So we have discussed homeostasis, we've discussed regulation, endocrine, excretory, and the coordination parts of homeostasis. Now we will look at the excretory system, and we'll look at the water balance that is maintained inside the body in a little more detail. So the first question, why is excretion at all necessary? So for any cell within the living body, within a living system, to be functional, you have to take in things that are required, you have to utilize them, break down what is necessary, and then remove anything that is unnecessary or toxic in nature, right? So in order for cells to stay alive, they must continuously, they must take in water as well as other molecules inside the cell. Yeah. However, if cells continuously just kept on taking in matter but did not excrete anything, then it would have to indefinitely keep on growing, which is, of course, something we know via any basic knowledge of cancer is extremely harmful. And it does not happen in any normal cell as well. So they have to export or take out what is coming inside, and these molecules also could have other roles as well. They might be signaling molecules like hormones. They might be glucose molecules which have to go to other cells. So there might be waste products that the cell simply needs to get rid of. So these are waste products and they're different sources. They can either have genetic sources, they can have uh, they can have some role in growth, they can be some sort of involvement in energy, etc. Now here we look at the different modes via which excretion can actually take place. So different, if you remember the different classification groups that we had discussed in our very initial sessions and in as part of the initial week's lectures. So there we understood how different types of organisms based on their food consumption, their way of surviving, etc., they have different modes of metabolism and different modes of excretion as well. So here we look at those. The different forms of excretion can be grouped into majorly a monotelism, which is where ammonia is removed from the body or ammonia is excreted from the body. Second is ureotelism, where urea is released from the individual's body. Then comes uricotelism, where uric acid is removed from individuals or from the living organism's body. Aminotelism, where amino acids are released, and guanotelism, where guanine is released, which is a quite unusual form of or unusual mode of excretion. So in animals, majorly, if you broadly classify excretory products, they can be grouped into ammonia, CO2, urea, uric acid, guanine, and creatine. So carbon dioxide, or commonly known as CO2, is a waste product simply of cellular respiration. It is not removed directly, but instead it is dumped into the blood, and then eventually lungs are responsible for their removal via exchange. Ammonia, NH3, is released in the form of, or it is removed via water. It is actually the result of breaking down proteins. So when proteins undergo digestion, ammonia is released, and it is also what makes bleach very smelly. So it is very poisonous to cells under very high concentrations, if you know, and therefore it has to be excreted or removed from normal healthy living cells from time to time, periodically. Now we talk about the different excretory organs. If you remember, this was the classification that we have already studied. So while all vertebrates, they have kidneys, therefore their excretory products are urea. Because of the difference in organismal complexity, the organs and organ systems that are present in these different levels or different kingdoms or different classes can also be quite varied. And as a result, if you don't have the same set or same efficiency of organs or excretory organs, then the product removed would also differ in nature. So for example, if you look at planaria, for example, planaria have flame cells. Earthworms, they have nephridia. Cockroaches, they have malficent tubules. And prawns, on the other hand, have antennal glands. So, depending upon how complex an organism is, how organized their bodies are, they can have different organs. So, what do excretory organs basically do? They are cleaning the blood. They are removing metabolic waste. They are releasing or removing any excess of solutes, excess of water, and removing it all in the form of urine. Yeah. Besides removing urea, it also removes any excess salt or glucose, any drug remnants, which is why for drug tests, usually urine tests are carried out, and it also removes excess water. So this is an example of the excretory system in case of humans, where you can see there are arteries and veins, the two kidneys, the two ureters, which are carrying over the uh, uh, filtered urine to the urinary bladder, which would then be removed via the urethra. So the two kidneys in the body, they receive somewhere between 1100 to 2000 liters of blood. 2000 liters of blood per day, almost the volume of a car, and they have to filter all of it. So it's a huge stress that your kidneys are enduring for such a large part of your life, and therefore if if you know somebody who is slightly in the senior age gap, they usually undergo these kidney function tests quite carefully, quite frequently, just to keep a check on how efficiently their organs are functioning. Now, because the body only has about 5.6 liters of blood, it gets circulated multiple times through the kidneys so that it can get cleaned once every 4 minutes. That's because constantly more and more uh, waste is being dumped into your blood, and therefore a continual filtering system has to operate within the body to keep a check on anything that might be released and anything that must be eliminated from the body. And it should not be allowed to accumulate and cause any harm to the body under normal circumstances. So here you see a cross section of the kidney as well. And then we come towards water balance. So water levels within an individual's body, they are also very carefully regulated. That's something we have already said before. So if the blood, under certain circumstances, if you're consuming too much water and your blood becomes too dilute, or if you are severely dehydrated and becomes very, very concentrated with solutes, then it would severely affect the normal cellular function in any individual. And it can if you would just remember the concept of hypertonic and isotonic solutions or osmosis, then that is basically the issue that any cell would suffer under such extreme conditions of dehydration or over water consumption. uh, So the kidneys are actually able to regulate this water concentration in the blood, and they're able to remove excess water if the blood becomes way too dilute, or if if enough water is not present in the blood, then they are able to conserve water within the body, and then the amount of urine that is excreted out of the body would be reduced. But either way, it is an indication that the water balance within the body has somehow been disrupted, and therefore such individuals usually have to keep their water consumption more under check. Then when we talk about the removal of ammonia, then once it has been excreted into the bloodstream by cells, it is carried over to the liver, where it is converted from ammonia into urea, which is a relatively much less toxic form. And then from the liver, it is then carried over to the kidneys, and then urea can be removed from the kidney. In the form of ammonia, it would be way too toxic for the cells, and instead removal in the form of urea is a lot safer. And then after transport into the kidneys, this can be removed from the body. So urine formation, if there's too much of water in the blood, it would be removed in the form of urine. If there's not enough, the kidneys will reabsorb more and more water back into the body, and accordingly it would be removed. If there is too much of urea or other solutes in the blood, then the kidneys would remove this excess solute. By regulating solute numbers and water volumes, the kidneys, under normal circumstances, are able to maintain homeostasis in the blood solute concentrate as well. So these are multiple functions that multiple ways in which kidney function can also get affected. So we have the ADH, the antidiuretic hormone, alcohol, aldosterone, caffeine, and increased blood pressure. All of these together affect the ability of the kidney to function. Therefore, they affect the water balance within the body, and therefore they affect a large part of the homeostasis within the body. So with this, we are concluding the recap for this week for now. And yeah, finally, we'll just go over a few questions that were part of the assignment, and then we can conclude our discussion for this week. So firstly, the question that was asked was that the epinephrine and the norepinephrine are produced in A, the pituitary, B, the thyroid, C, the suprarenal glands, or D, the mammary glands. So the answer to this are the suprarenal glands. Yeah, supra, adrenal. Yeah. Okay. So adrenal glands are placed just above the kidney. Like the localization within the body is just above the kidney, and therefore adrenals are also, or in other words, adrenal also means pretty much that only. They mean they are adjacent to the renal glands, which are the kidneys, and they are otherwise also called as the suprarenal glands. So that's how you can tackle questions like this as well if you don't directly see adrenals as an option. Secondly, the T3 hormone that is released by the thyroid gland is A, thyroxine, B, iodothyroxine, C, iodothyronine, or D, triiodothyronine. So if you remember, we had discussed this previously as well, that T3, 3 is because it has tri in its name. So that is triiodothyronine. And T4 is for thyroxine. Then in question 3, we were asked that the TSH, or the thyroid stimulating hormone, is produced in A, the thyroid gland, B, the suprarenal gland, C, the pancreatic gland, or D, the pituitary gland. So like you might remember that any releasing or inhibitory hormone would be released obviously from the pituitary. So the correct answer to this is also pituitary as well. So the master gland, the pituitary, would release this thyroid stimulating hormone, and then this would act upon the thyroid gland, which would release T3 and T4 hormones as well as calcitonin along with the parathyroid glands. There's some issue here. I don't know. Second. Just the problem here. Okay. Uh, in question 4, we were asked that vasopressin is also known as um, dash, which is released by. So vasopressin is responsible for the regulation of how much blood would be released into, sorry, how much urine would actually be synthesized by the body, or it would actually control the it would control the water that is retained in the body and the water that is allowed to be excreted out. So it is also known as the antidiuretic hormone, and its release is from the pituitary gland. So that is by that is by option B. In question 5, we are asked that glucagon is a hormone that is released in dash and is responsible for regulating blood glucose levels. So if you remember our discussion about the pancreas, we had seen how alpha and beta cells are responsible for releasing different hormones differently. So insulin is the hormone that is responsible for um, breaking it reduces. So under conditions where blood glucose is already quite high, insulin is required to increase its utilization and effectively reduce the amount of blood glucose in the body so that it does not cause long-term damage to all of the internal organs. On the other hand, glucagon does the complete opposite, and it increases under condition of low blood glucose. It increases the breakdown of glycogen into glucose, and it produces more and more glucose which can be released into the bloodstream for such individuals. So it regulates the blood glucose levels, and all of this are secreted, as I previously said, by the pancreas. And the pancreas also releases somatostatin, which causes a decrease in levels of both, and it regulates both these negatively regulated or negatively acting hormones. Yeah. Then in question 6, we were asked that the excretory organs which are present in cockroaches. So this was a direct question that was present in the lecture notes as well. Um, the options here are in antennal glands, flame cells, Malpighian tubules, or the kidney. So the answer to that is most certainly the Malpighian tubules, which are released by which are present in cockroaches and are acting as the excretory organs for them. Nephridia, on the other hand, again part of the same slide as well from the same lecture. Nephridia in cockroaches, sorry, in earthworms are responsible for the excretion part. So different animals, once again, they have, based on their different complexity, have different excretory organs which perform quite similar or yeah, similar sort of functions. The correct order of the homeostasis machinery is um, again, a very, very direct question, not much to really tackle here. You have the stimulus, then you have the sensor. For the sensor would sense the stimulus that has come in. Then comes the integrator, which integrates whatever information has come in to the regulator or the effector. And the effector would then generate a response, which would manifest in the form of a result. Then in question 9, we have inhibin, which is secreted by, if you remember our discussion on GnRH, then it is actually released by the testes. So the gonadotrophin releasing hormone, it causes the release of FSH and LH, which acts upon the testes, and then it leads to inhibin release. Then in question 10, we were asked that somatomedins are a group of A, steroids, B, lipids, Yeah, A, steroids, B, lipids, C, sphingolipids, or D, proteins. Then the answer here would be proteins. Then in question 11, we were asked that excess cortisol production is related to which disorder? Then hypercortisolism, if you remember, we had discussed, is uh is a problem that is encountered during Cushing's syndrome. And in question 12, we were asked that the target organ of the antidiuretic hormone, which also, as we discussed in a previous question, is known as vasopressin, is the kidney. It acts upon the kidney. And finally, in question 13, we were asked that which hormone prevents the excess loss of sodium potassium from the kidneys. Then that is the aldosterone. And yeah, that was actually present in a schematic as well. You can go over it once if that's required. And in question 14, we were asked that in a biological system, the okay, so this is actually the definition of the entire week's topics. So the preservation of a steady environment independent of external variables is called, um, obviously it is homeostasis. I'm not even going through all of the different questions, different options. The answer here would be homeostasis. And finally, the ammonotelic type of excretion happens in A, frog, B, amoeba, C, humans, or it is D, scorpion. So the answer to this would be amoeba. They show the release or they excrete ammonia from their bodies. So with this, I think we are at the end of our session, and we will only have one last session for the upcoming week. And after that, we would be done for this course for this time. And as always, if you have any doubts, you can leave them. You can uh, post them on the discussion forum. You can mail anybody, or you can attend any of the sessions. You can go over them in the YouTube links as well, and go through the presentations, go through the lecture notes, and your exam should be quite easy to tackle. And yeah, that is it for today. Thank you, and I hope you have a good evening, and bye.